All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ibrahim Demir, and I am the Executive Director at Zahra Institute. Today, I will be moderating our guest speaker, Jihan Mohammed's talk. But before I introduce our guest speaker, Jihan Mohammed, I would like to make just a couple announcements about our programs and our events. Let me share my screen with our current program series, the speaker series. And I'll drop this in the chat as well so that you have um, you can mark your calendar when they are happening. So the next talk will be given by Frangiz Ghadari, and it's going to be on Untold Kurdish Women's Histories, and that will take place on March 19 and at 12 p.m. Central Time. And you can also view our past and future events on our YouTube channel, at Zahra Institute YouTube channel, which you'll find the link in the chat as well. And if you would like to stay informed of our programs and events, please subscribe to our newsletter on our website or the QR code you will get in the event chat here. And you can also follow us on Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, and other social media platforms like Instagram. Welcome again. So today our guest speaker is Jihan Mohammed. This is the second session of our 2025 Spring Speaker Series. And Jihan Mohammed will be speaking on the interrelationship of vegetarianism, religion, culture, and identity, and class. Jihan Mohammed is a sociologist whose research focuses on investigating how ethnic and sectarian identities are constructed and deconstructed in the contemporary Middle East. She is a former faculty lecturer at Vanderbilt University's Sociology Department, and she has published work on Kurdish identity and ethno-religious dynamics. Without any further ado, I would like to give the mic to Jihan, and this will be approximately 45 minutes of talk, and then we will have a question and answer session afterwards. Please, Jihan, floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am very excited about today's topic. I am looking forward to have a productive discussion around vegetarian diet at the intersection of Kurdish identity, religion, and class. Let me share my screen for a second. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Sure. I don't see everyone. Okay, let's do this. So this picture, I took this picture a few days ago. These are some of the beans and some of the wild plants, which I will talk about a little bit in today's presentation. Ibrahim, Nilay, and I were talking about the plant right here. In Duhok, in Bahdini dialect, we call it hangadan. It's typically um, it it is foraged in spring, so you either cook it fresh with rice or you dry it and eat it in winter, and that's what I do. I am overseas, so I typically ask my family to send them to me with some relative, or when I go to Kurdistan, I get some of these plants and cook them. And this one has a very strong aroma. Not a lot of people like it, the smell, but the taste is really good. And sometimes it's used for digestive issues. I know a lot of elderly believe in the healing power of this plant. So when they have digestive issues, they would just cook it with rice and eat it. The one on the lower right, it's called Gari, and I know it has a different name in Sorani dialect, and I'm sure it has different names in other Kurdish dialects, but in Bahdini we call it Gari. It is a poisonous plant, so you have to be really careful cook it. It needs to be cooked for, for about an hour and a half and two, and then you add tahine and smoke. And people prefer to add meat to it. I don't eat meat, so you just cook it as a soup or add it to rice. But you do need to add smoke, so it has a soury taste. And then the one on the lower left, it's actually a mix of wild plants. My mom mixed them for me. Again, these are typically found in spring, and you cook them with rice. All of these are cooked with rice, for the exception of gari. You can eat it as a soup. This one right here in the middle, that one is, I found very few people eat that plant. It's typically added to tea. That's what my grandmother used to do. It's found near creeks or water. It is hard to find. Again, it's wild. You just dry it and add some of it to your tea for flavor. So what I will be talking about today, it's a chapter that is part of this book, exploring topics in non-human coexistence, passion, praxis, and presence. This is a book edited by some of my vegan colleagues. Those are three amazing activists who are doing so much work for animals and animals' rights. Sarah Tomasello, Aaron Johns, Mark Sukita, and Nathan Poirier. They're doing an amazing work, and my chapter is the only one about Kurds and the Kurdish identity. I have the link where to get the book. It's available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, and another platform. But if you just type the name Exploring Topics in Non-Human Coexistence, you should be able to pre-order the book. It will be out on March 16, I believe. But you can go ahead and pre-order the book. So what does this chapter talks about? In this chapter, I talk about my journey transitioning to vegetarianism 6 years ago, and I discuss the mixed reactions from my Muslim Kurds in my community. My experience is based in Bashur, specifically in Duhok city. So any time I talk about the reactions or the interactions I've had with Kurdish Muslim Kurds, it is based again on the people in my community. These experiences and these reactions could vary based on the city, again, or based on other parts of Kurdistan in Bakur, in Rojhelat, or in Rojava. So please keep that in mind. My goal writing this chapter is to further complicate the debate between religion and animals, specifically at the intersection of ethnicity and class. I start the chapter discussing the Islamic ethics and laws pertaining to animals, and I address some of the concerns Muslim Kurdish omnivores have about transitioning to a plant-based diet. I do want to say one sentence or two about the style of this book. This is an untraditional writing style that my colleagues, the editors of the books, are trying to push. It's they call it a radical way of writing and publishing, where the author has a strong voice talking about their own personal experiences, as compared to traditional academic writing and publishing, where you collect data and either run your regression analysis or analyze all these interviews. So the writing style is free, and I loved that. It allowed me to insert my voice and my experience. So in this chapter, I argue that for some Kurdish Muslims, vegetarianism and veganism are a form of Western neocolonialism that puts the ethics of Kurdish food, religion, and culture into question. And I conclude the chapter discussing how the traditional Kurdish cuisine is actually vegan and vegetarian friendly. And I based that argument on the idea that access to meat historically, at least in the parts of Kurdistan where I come from, was scarce. The Kurds typically consumed more plant-based food than meat. Nonetheless, today, and thanks to industrialization and globalization of meat production, these factors have changed all the cuisines, including the Kurdish cuisine. So the first section of my chapter talks about religion, and in that I discuss how animals, including insects, are mentioned in a Quran in over 200 Quranic verses. And I mentioned different surahs and ayats in the Quran where the idea, it conveys the idea that animals are created for humans to be consumed, to be eaten, to be taken care of, and to be used if needed, such as donkeys and horses. And all the Quranic verses that mentions animals, they point out again that animals are created by God. Some of them are created for the man to be domesticated again, to be used, and other to be eaten and consumed. And that's where most of my chapter talks about or investigates. So for example, sheep, goat, and cattle are commonly domesticated. Their meat is consumed. They are used for wool. Their wool is used, or their skin. And other animals such as donkey, horses, and camels are used for transportation. And in Islam, there are many instances where animals are sacrificed, or the sacrifice of animals is ordained and sometimes even encouraged. For example, during the Eid al-Adha, Jajna Qurban, Muslims, those who can afford it, are recommended sacrificing sheep, goats, and cows, or other animals. And the word Adha, Qurban, literally means sacrifice in Arabic. I also in the chapter talk about Prophet Ibrahim's encounter with God when he was commanded to sacrifice his son, and he was about to sacrifice his son, and then God told him, "O Abraham, you have already fulfilled the vision. Indeed, this is how we reward the good doers. That was truly a revealing test, and we ransomed his son with a great sacrifice." So this Quranic version of Prophet Ibrahim or Abraham in the book of Genesis story, this is about, about the shocking command that he needs to sacrifice his son, but then it was replaced by an animal. This encounter is often mentioned by Muslims, and that's how the sacrifice of animal is justified during certain rituals for specific religious rituals, again, such as Eid al-Adha or Jajna Qurban. So the major point of contention or debate between Muslims and vegans and vegetarians is that practices surrounding meat consumption, and in the case of Muslims, it's the halal slaughtering. Halal slaughtering is a signifier of the Muslim identity, but at the same time, it is a point of contention between this practice and vegans and vegetarians. So veganism and vegetarianism seems to challenge the primacy of the religious identity, just like other, Judeo-Christian religions that comes under fire by vegans and vegetarian activists. Islamic animal ethics too has come under fire, specifically religious slaughter. So here I present two viewpoints. Western advocates, for example, for non-human animal rights, they have characterized these religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as anthropocentric. However, in the defense of Islam, Muslims insist that Islam is highly attentive of the well-being of non-humans. For example, there are different laws governing animals' treatment, rearing, breeding, the pre and the post-slaughtering process. It is a complicated process. How do you take the animal to the slaughtering site? How do you care for that animal? And after that, how do you care for that meat after the slaughtering process happens? So, like other Abrahamic religions, Islam requires Muslims to treat animals with kindness. Harming them physically and even psychologically or killing them without a justifiable reason is one of the major sins in Islam. Another example of the protection or the laws that protects animals is the protection extended to aged and deceased animals. Muslims are required to spend time and money on those animals, even if they no longer benefit humans. So, some scholars have an issue with this argument, the argument that Islam actually cares about animals and animals' well-beings, and those scholars call this approach as apologetic. It is again when Muslims and many times Muslim scholars argue that Islam is highly attentive of the well-being of non-human creatures, and they insist that Islam actually predates West by many centuries in advocating for animals and animal well-beings. So I agree with those scholars that this approach comes across as apologetic. And I am afraid, again, this is the argument I make in this chapter, I am afraid that the Islamic tradition is not entirely innocent or free of problematic views and practices from an animal rights point of view, specifically concerns surrounding killings for food. And I believe that this will remain one of the major points of contention between Muslims and animal rights advocates. Um, there is another argument where the West tends to romanticize and idealize older indigenous cultures and religions. And those authors are concerned that this romanticization of religions such as Islam or Christianity and other indigenous cultures and practices would prevent us from asking critical questions on animals' ethics. And I do want to extend this discussion to argue that my fellow Muslim scholars and omnivores tend to idealize Islam's teaching and laws pertaining non-human animals. And I am concerned that this approach could prevent vegan and vegetarian Muslims from asking critical questions and preventing them from having a productive dialogue. Nonetheless, and this is a really important point for me, I also understand the cultural and the political anxieties underlying this apologetic approach that comes from Muslims and some Muslim scholars. And Muslims do have good reasons to be wary of the Western animal advocacy. After centuries of colonialism and imperialism, the West continues to use religion, gender, and more recently, animal advocacy to radicalize others and dehumanize them. And part of the concern is that animal advocacy has been used as a pretext to inflict physical and social violence against Muslims. And an example of that would be the number of animal rights campaigns in Europe that recently have been denounced as smear campaigns, specifically against Jews and Muslims. Now, is religiosity strictly correlated with opposition to veganism and vegetarianism? And I think this is a really interesting question. Anecdotally, I have noticed that Muslim Kurdish omnivores, those who consume meat, have different degrees of religiosity. There are those who are devoted Muslims, they strictly follow Islam's teaching in everyday lives, but also there are those who are less religious, barely praying, for example. The latter category, the less religious category, interests me the most. And often conversations around veganism and vegetarianism starts on non-religious basis. When they struggle to address some concerns vegans and vegetarians have, they tend to use the religious card to cope with guilt and discomfort. They state that God alone determines what is lawful and what is unlawful regarding what can be eaten and what cannot be eaten. In fact, in Islam, Muslims are required to eat what is lawful, wholesome, pure, nutritious, and safe, and are prohibited to eat anything that is impure or harmful. There is a specific verse often referenced by Muslim Kurdish omnivores that suggests that humans should not attribute to themselves the authority to proclaim things either lawful or unlawful according to their own wishes. And the verse says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, believers do not hold as unlawful the good things which Allah has made lawful to you, and do not exceed the bounds of right. Allah does not love those who transgress the bounds of right. So Muslim Kurdish omnivores argue that vegans and vegetarians transgress that God's rule. This is a debate I had multiple times with my Kurdish fellow who bring religion into question. On the one hand, they struggle to understand who am I, or who vegans are and vegetarians are, to question the ethics of servability of animals to humans. Only God can determine that. On the other hand, I and some vegans, or all vegans and some vegetarians, struggle to understand how slaughtering an animal is not a form of extreme violence committed against non-humans. And they struggle to understand how Allah, who in Islam is attributed as compassionate and merciful, would actually condemn someone who is vegan and vegetarian, because that's the argument sometimes Muslim omnivores would do, that vegans and vegetarians, they are transgressing this God's rule, thus they are condemned by God. So how, and the other question I pose here, how is advocating for ceasing the exploitation of animals, including killing them or sacrificing them, is not an act of compassion? In fact, and this is key in my chapter, there are no statements in Quran or in Hadith that suggest that abstaining from eating meat is sinful, or it's a sinful act for which the human will be punished. So the question I pose here is why some Kurdish Muslim omnivores would paint vegans and vegetarians as less of a Muslim. This brings up another issue often misunderstood by some Muslims, which is, are animals inferior to humans? This is a complicated question that Zahra Talili tackles in her book. There are no explicit statements in Quran that indicates human domination over non-human. The opposite, for example, is true in the Genesis, but in Islam there aren't. Nonetheless, some Quranic verses tend to be interpreted as though humans have a special status or are superior over animals. This could explain why some Muslim Kurdish omnivores believe animals do not have feelings or emotion. And I believe this is a simplistic argument. I often hear from people who say animals do not have emotions and feelings, thus they do not feel the pain that comes with the slaughtering process. God has created them without emotions and feeling, so they are good to be killed and slaughtered. And the other argument those Muslims make, they insist that the halal slaughtering is the least painful method to kill animals. On the other hand, vegans and vegetarians argue any method, including halal slaughtering, results in the death of another being, an act that they cannot comprehend. So as mentioned earlier, Quranic verses convey the idea that everything on earth and in heaven is created by God and is serviceable. In Arabic, there's the term musakhar to human, which means they are created for the human. And this conceptualization of animals and the idea that they are created to be used in different ways often implies their inferiority. And growing up, I'm sure some of you as well, oftentimes we hear how average Muslims perceive animals. They are less human. They don't have the ability to reason, to use logic, or have control over their sexual desires, for example. Thus, killing them is justifiable, or they do not have emotions and feelings. They are not scared when they are about to be slaughtered. However, these views are not shared by all Muslim scholars and theologians. There are theologians and Muslim scholars who actually think that animals are intelligent to some degree and can reason properly. So this disconnect between the normative and the empirical dimensions of Islam is an issue indeed. So even if the religion has the best teachings about animals, it means little if these teachings are not are misunderstood by average Muslims. The second part of my chapter talks about the ethnic identity, and this is where I insert the Kurdish identity. And the question I pose here, what does it mean to be Kurdish and vegetarian, or being Kurdish and vegan? The first concern Kurdish omnivores have is health. Many believe that plants cannot provide all nutrients, and thus vegans and vegetarians are susceptible to imminent disease, or they are malnourished. As most readers are aware, these arguments have been debunked by tons of studies. Plants can actually provide, if not all, the types of nutrients that you can get. And the second concern Kurdish omnivores have is consuming meat and avoiding meat convey a social identity and an affiliation. And because Kurdish cuisine does have meals made with meat, so consuming them or not consuming them convey a social identity and an affiliation to a specific group. So in religions such as Islam, refusing meat is strictly associated with criticism of the religion's ethics. And in Kurdishness, or not consuming meat in a Kurdish community could be associated with criticism of your own community's habits, your community's ethics, your community's piety, purity, culture, etc. Eating Kurdish dishes that are halal meat-based. So in this case, I'm inserting the religious identity and the ethnic identity. So if you're a Muslim and you're Kurdish and you're eating halal-based meals, this is a signifier of the Kurdish Muslim identity. And if you refuse those dishes, that demarcates a distinctive identity. More importantly, adopting an identity such as vegetarian or vegan, one confronts the problem of competing identities, competing loyalties, and norms. So being Muslim, Kurd, and vegetarian means being a critic of our ancestors' eating habits, our community's ethics, our community's purity. It means your religious authenticity and Kurdish authenticity, whatever that means based on the individual and the region, I would say, are put into question. So my Kurdish fellow assume that after transitioning to vegetarianism, I must have given up on so many Kurdish dishes. Thus, my Kurdishness is less than when I was on a meat-based diet. And here I debunk that myth. But before, I do want to give a historical overview about the Kurdish food and the types of staples we use in the Kurdish cuisine. Lamb, beef, chicken, and dairy are staples of the Kurdish cuisine. That is a fact. And in the chapter, I discuss the cultural anxieties by providing a historical overview of how much meat and how often meat was consumed, as well as wild plants. And that's explained why the first picture that I showed you, I have it there. And in this final part of the chapter, I aim to debunk the myth that transitioning to veganism and vegetarianism means giving up on the Kurdish roots. So this is a historical overview. I'll try to be brief. My Kurdish ancestors have lived for centuries as herders and farmers in the mountainous areas of northern Iraq, also known as Iraqi Kurdistan region. And all throughout the 20th century, Kurds relied on livestock and agriculture as main source of income. So villagers in the mountains where my parents and grandparents come from owned land and worked on it. Many owned some land inherited from their fathers and grandfathers, but only few people or few villagers had animals that they kept, mainly sheep and goat, and occasionally cattle, mules, donkeys, and horses. And due to political instabilities and sanctions, access to meat was scarce in general, at least in those areas that I pointed out. Many seniors, like my parents and grandparents, often recall how lucky those families were who could afford slaughtering a sheep or a goat for the cold days of the winter or for the holy month of Ramadan. They report that meat was consumed once a week or once a month, mostly on Holy Fridays or on Eid's, Jihan, or during social occasions such as weddings and funerals. And according to some scholars who traveled in Bashur, they noticed that when animals were slaughtered, some of the meat was consumed, the rest of it was either dried or cured for harsher seasons of the year, including intestines. And as far as eggs and dairy, villagers who didn't have any domesticated animals typically exchanged crops or labor with milk and eggs. So butter, dairy in general, such as geshk. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with geshk. Is made from strained yogurt. And cheese were consumed more often than meat. As far as preserving meat, freezing nowadays has replaced with the old methods of drying meat. And I'm sure you've heard your grandparents drying meat for winter or for other seasons. But today people mainly freeze meat. One of the popular Kurdish dishes is qali. It is made from the meat curated in animal's fat, and it is served as an entree, and sometimes it is added to other dishes, for example, rice or soup, just for flavor. And I in fact, grew up eating eggs fried in qali's fat. But again, you can use it for flavor or just eat it as a main dish. Another popular dish is serupe, also known as kebaya. It's made from sheep's stomach, intestines, legs, head, and intestines are, clean, and then they're stuffed with grounded meat, rice, salt, and black pepper. And I'm sure there are variations of this recipe. And then they're boiled in the bone broth made out of the legs and the head of the animal. In any case, because accessing meat was historically scarce in the region, it was often referred to as the food of aghas and sheikhs. Even today, for many Kurds, meat is perceived as the rich people food. So eating meat confers feelings of power, of status, despite its abundant availability today on the market. And perhaps you can recall visiting someone, and if the host doesn't cook meat for you, that would indicate either the class of the host, the person is poor and cannot afford meat, or the host is disrespecting you or is not respecting you enough to cook meat for you. So again, the point is meat is perceived as the rich people food, and it confers feelings of power and status. With that being said, I insist that the traditional Kurdish cuisine is vegan and vegetarian friendly. My ancestors, again, were herders and farmers. They mainly consumed crops and wild plants, and they planted a wealth of native crops such as rice, wheat, barley, corn, lentils, chickpeas, and other other crops. The list goes on, and including fruits. Our soil, at least the soil in Iraqi Kurdistan regions, and specifically in Duhok and the surrounding areas, is suited for grapes, pomegranates, figs, pear, peach, plums, and the list goes on and on. In fact, one of the most Kurdish traditional dishes is the soup of dried fruits, also known as khushav. Khushav consists of dried apricots, apples, plums, pears, and raisins. They're all boiled together to make a sweet, soury juice. And for extra flavor, some people add walnuts, almonds, and wild pistachio. Also called gazon. Kurdish seniors report that they consumed fresh or dried fruits and nuts as snacks on a daily basis, and they used to serve them for guests as well. Sadly, political instability, globalization, and rapid urbanization has changed some of these traditions. So healthy plant-based snacks that our ancestors and parents and grandparents used to consume and serve to their guests, now they are replaced with sugary pastries, cookies, junk food, and energy drinks. As far as wild plants, foraging is a tradition that dates back centuries. That's when people would go to virgin lands on the mountains to get those wild plants and cook them and consume them. And according to Pierunian colleagues, they visited the Kurdistan region and they did an extensive study on the amount and the number of wild plants that Kurds go and gather during the spring. And they argue that Kurds tend to gather and consume the largest number of wild plants, and spring tends to be the busiest seasons. These plants are consumed again as raw or cooked or fried, and sometimes they are dried for winter. Typically cooked with rice, but also could be cooked as soups or added to salads. Some of them in today's practices, they would either seal and freeze or sun dry them. One of their characteristics is the strong taste and aroma, and Kurdish seniors grew up foraging themselves, so they enjoyed that practice. It was an occasion to socialize with their friends and family and go on this trip hunting for these wild plants, and then bringing them and cooking them and enjoying the taste and the aroma. On the other hand, we have younger generations who grew up in cities who oftentimes despise the smell or the taste. So it is common in a Kurdish household to see parents and grandparents cook and eat these wild plants, and children and grandchildren complain about the strong taste and smell. So the political, we can safely say the political events of the second half of the 20th century explain these generational differences. Mhm. So finally, after transitioning to vegetarianism, I started cooking more traditional dishes without meat, be that using wild plants that I used to despise and dislike when my parents and grandparents would cook, or cook traditional Kurdish dishes without meat. And one of the surprises to many is, for example, how to make kubba halab on kutla halabi or tarshik without meat, or even dolma, how to make these dishes without meat. To many people, it is a surprise, but to me, it's a very easy process where you replace meat with eggplants, cauliflower, whatever you like, or even mushrooms, or any other vegetable that you wish. It could be easily replaced with meat. So the point I'm trying to make here, I have not stopped eating traditional Kurdish dishes. It is actually the contrary. After my transition, I started um, exploring specifically wild plants and eating them for the first time, and in fact introducing them to my children. Yesterday, for example, I made gari, the wild plant that you saw on the first slide, and I fed it to my 2-year-old and 4-year-old, and they loved it. And that's part of being Kurdish, that's part of being Kurdish and Muslim. And again, this is to debunk the idea that transitioning to veganism and vegetarianism is a Western identity, or it's an attack on our ancestors' um, culture, purity, piety, or it means giving up on one's identity and affiliation. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jihan, very much for this great presentation. Now it's time for questions or comments. You can leave your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand to take the mic to ask the question. Jihan, are you still sharing?
I think so.
Okay, because we see a black screen right now.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you can stop or yeah, come back to it. Yeah, there you go. We see you now.
Okay. Were you able to see the screen before, or?
Yeah, we saw your presentation on the purpose of your chapter, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. Mujahid wants to ask a question. I see. He's
Yeah.
raising his hand.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Sorry, I had another talk, a book talk, so I joined slightly late, but as far as I could listen, it's very interesting. I felt like the idea that vegetarianism is not Kurdish compatible, culturally it makes perfect sense. But to think of it as a Western element. Is that really so among the Kurds? I mean, maybe Kurds in the US have such a perception because they didn't come across it before. Because, typically vegetarianism is a Eastern thing, from India, China, and so on, rather than a Western thing. What would you say on that? And also, I thought, you are kind of a pioneer in a field, so you are offering an account of what is there in terms of attitudes, perceptions. You going into the details of the different dishes, food types with respect to vegetarianism and so on, is quite eye-opening. It's a new sphere, domain for many people. So there's a lot of exciting stuff, but I wonder how much of this is really an artifact of our American lives rather than Kurdish, broader Kurdish context.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, I have a harder time reasoning with my Kurds from back home in Kurdistan region. And for example, yesterday I was talking to my friend, and her sister overheard about this presentation, and she asked, "What is it about?" And I talked about vegetarianism and veganism, and she learned I don't consume meat. And the comment she made, it was, "Oh, have you become Christian because you live in the West, and this must be, a Christian American thing." Other comments would be, and possibly because I live in the USA, "Oh, it must be a Western influence," when in fact, like you said, vegetarianism and veganism is part of many indigenous cultures in the East. There is a population, I forgot the name, in Pakistan. They do not consume meat, and they are the healthiest people ever found. Their diet is based on mainly dried fruits, for example. But this is an interesting point that I didn't think about. It could be because of me living in the United States. Uh, Many Kurds would think this is a Western influence, or this is an American influence on me becoming a vegetarian. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. To provoke, maybe, there's a hand. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Mencius. I'm in Pasadena, California. I am in Momosta Ibrahim's research methods class and Momosta Shahed's Sarani class. I commend you on this work around vegetarianism. I myself am a vegetarian, was a vegan for a while. And traveling to Suli, it is the place where I stay. It's always a challenge. So I don't want to be rude. So I just eat the food that's in front of me. But I have to say that the rich diet of beans and rice and vegetables is very much it suits me when I'm in the city. I know where to go to sort of keep within my lifestyle. And I'm Mexican American, and this is a conversation that we're having as well, being a community of meat eaters. But I just want to recommend a couple of cookbooks. Decolonizing your diet. It's plant-based Mexican American recipes, and then Green Rocket cookbook. But I find those to be really helpful when I'm cooking for my partner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, for those recommendations. I'll definitely look into them.
Thank you, Nancy. There's somebody who wants to talk, I think. I heard the mic was on, but
Yeah, this is Connie. I'm with Mustafa.
hi, Connie.
Hi. We just listened to your lecture. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's very interesting. I guess it's interesting to talk about it from a Kurdish perspective, because I mean that's the point of it, is that we don't really hear it in the Kurdish perspective. As I was born and raised in the U.S. It's funny, Nancy, you mentioned Semania. My dad is from Semania. Food is such a big part of that culture, and I'm sure Mexican culture you can relate as well. And so obviously you can't go to somebody's house and say you're on a diet. So let's just start there because anytime you try to tell them that, you don't want fried foods or you don't want carbs, it's just part of the culture to reject food. It just, it doesn't go over very well. I would say I know a lot of people from like Erbil, Seymania, Baghdad, a lot of people who don't like red meat, for example. That seems to be kind of common. I think maybe I'm surprised that they would ask you like if you became Christian, but I just wonder if the no meat aspect of it. So it's not like a preference, like it's a rule. And that's, I think, what people maybe are not understanding exactly. Because like if you say, oh, like for example, I don't really prefer fish, and nobody thinks that that's like a religious thing. I think people understand preferences. They don't understand when you create a rule for yourself. And that just might be some of the confusion and the questions that they ask.
That is very true. Yes. It gets more complicated when you're with an extended family where there are follow-up questions. Then what do you prefer? Do you want me to replace meat with chicken? And then you're like, I don't prefer chicken. And they're like, then what is the reason? Is there like a health issue? There are many follow-up questions. And I do my best not to make the discussion about me and my diet and what I eat and what not eat. But there are occasions where you cannot escape those questions. And yeah, the interactions becomes really interesting.
I see two hands up. Rachel, would you like to ask your question or take the mic?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was really extremely interesting. As an American married into a family from Bakur, I can understand what you're talking about, but at the same time, I was almost surprised because when I'm with my family in either Diyarbakir or Istanbul, I find that meals are, no one has an objection to meat, but meals are more often vegetarian than not. Things like a turshuk made entirely of vegetables is just the standard. Any kind of dolma not having meat in it is kind of the standard. But what I was curious about, I've noticed that recently Palestinian Americans have been bringing forward conversations about foraging wild plants as a key part of identity and also as a kind of land claim. So like the two kind of handcrafts activities that are, strongly associated with women, strongly associated with Palestine are tatriz, embroidery, and foraging wild plants. And I wondered if you could, it may be early days, but anticipate a similar kind of discourse evolving among Kurds in America, where it isn't only about health, but it's also about being rooted in a place and asserting your right to that place.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rachel. So for the Kurds, and I didn't talk about this in this presentation, but in the chapter I talk about the challenges of foraging wild plants nowadays because of the Turkish and the Iranian bombardment of Kurdish villages, because those plants are found near the villages or in the surroundings, and you have to go and hunt for them. And I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but civilians have been killed by the Turkish forces and the Iranian forces, mistaking them, labeling them as a threat because they found two men in the wilderness on the mountain doing something, and they have been killed. So that has discouraged actually people to go and look for those plants. And on the other hand, the Iraqi Kurdish government has failed to revive the agricultural sector, to make the process of going back to the villages. And again, this is something I didn't talk about, but many villages today are abandoned, including my grandparents' village, Big Dauda, which is right on the border with Turkey. They have been abandoned because of the ethnic cleansing process that happened in the 1970s and 80s. And even so, even if people want to go, they are afraid to go because, again, of Turkey and Iran, and because there is not much support from their local government. But I see where the question comes from, and it is a form of claiming land, and I'm hopeful those political factors change and people are able to go back and get those plants without any fear.
Thank you. I think Mamoste Nilay had her hand up earlier, so I'll give the mic to her to ask her question.
Yes. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on today, but it was really interesting in so many ways, particularly because I was a vegetarian for so many years, even as a kid. And then that changed at some point because of circumstances. So I have a lot, it resonates with me at a personal level. And then I also have to emphasize that just the topic itself is a great contribution to Kurdish studies, because when we think of Kurdish studies, we almost always think about the political processes, violence, and the reactions to it. So in this presentation talks to the ways in which Kurdishness is experienced in so many different ways, in so many different realms. So thank you for that. My question is not at a personal level, but I know that this project is quite personal for you, and it is based on your personal experiences as a Kurdish woman who lives in the United States, but has quite tight connections with home and with the tradition itself. But my question is more analytical. The way you talked about religious discourses, whether it is discouraging vegetarianism or it is stigmatizing it from an Islamic point of view, or those against it, counter arguments, the way you talk about these religious discourses is like, you know, when we talk about religion, we can talk about it in so many different ways, as an experience, as a sociological category, in terms of text. But I felt like you are attributing a monolithic kind of character to Islam, the way you talk about it, in terms of where its arguments comes from, a lot of emphasis on texts and textual analysis. But when I think of like cuisine, diets, like in terms of sociology of food at large, what comes to my mind, the first thing that comes to my mind is not text and what it says, but geography, environment, topography across time and space. I mean, I'm more familiar with, of course, Bakur, and the topographical and ecological differences have a lot of bearing on what people eat and what they think is okay to eat. So can you elaborate a little bit more on how do you conceptualize religion? How do you kind of like deal with it as a form of textual analysis, as a form of authority, as a sociological reality? Is there a way that you can make this argument still personal, but maybe not falling into the trap of attributing this monolithic category, you know, or attribute to religion?
Yes, that's a great question, and thank you. I'm so happy to see you, Neil. I missed you. So I am not a theologian. I'm not a religious scholar, and even I was hesitant to include those Quranic verses in the first place in the text because, again, of the interpretation. What does it mean? And I'm an average Muslim. To some, I may not be actually a good Muslim. I'm not wearing the veil, for example, etc., etc. But I had to provide those texts to explain Islam's relationship with animals, how Islam conceptualizes animals. The reactions that I explain, and I think I failed to do a good job explaining, those reactions come oftentimes from average Muslims, and typically and interestingly from not very Muslims. Like they barely pray, for example, they barely fast, or they don't read Quran, but on their ID it is written Islam. And once you navigate those discussions, they again would use the religion and start mentioning those verses that I am doing something wrong. So hopefully I can do a better job in the next writing explaining those variances and average Muslims' interpretation of those verses. My vision of Islam does have really good laws protecting animals' well-beings. However, one point will remain forever as a point of contention. It is the slaughtering. We can explain the process of caring, for example, for elderly animals, for how to care for them, how to breed them ethically, etc., which again goes against veganism and vegetarianism. But the slaughtering point, it's where they would disagree forever. It's not something I am claiming. Vegans are against the killing of animals. And if you're a Muslim, on some occasions, you are encouraged to sacrifice an animal. So I'm not sure if that answered. I feel like I'm blubbing. But...
No, I mean, no, it does. And you're very generous. You did a wonderful job of explaining every aspect of your study. What I had in mind was basically, you know, things like, I don't know, jurisdictional differences in Islam when it comes to these questions. Historicity of dealing with these questions in Islam. So I totally understand where the way you explain these arguments and where they come from. It was just the point about maybe just making it more nuanced in the sense that these don't necessarily refer to, you know, opinions within Islam as much as they refer to particular interpretations of those in particular historical spatial contexts, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. I do have like a small segment on the practices of Islam. And I think I briefly mentioned that even if Islam has laws pertaining animal well-beings, they mean little if people do not practice them. So here, the culprit is not Islam, it's people who practice this religion and do not adhere to these laws. But thank you for the comment, Neil. I'm happy you're here today.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, and thank you. It was great seeing you.
Thank you very much, Nilay and John. Actually, I have a comment or a question about the cross-culturally shared cuisines. Like, you mentioned dolma, and it's claimed by many different ethnic groups or nationalities, like Arabs, Turks, and Kurds. What's your take on that? It's a strong part of sense of like national identity. Like when they claim, patents, like, oh, we have the patent for dolma or baklava, for example. What's your take on that?
I think this is the most difficult question I've received today. I think my simple answer is I don't know. I don't know who invented this dish, but I know it's an integral part of the Duhuki cuisine. If I go to a house and they are, hosting me, one of the dishes that I'm 100% sure I will see is dolma.
Yeah, there are many other dishes like that, everybody claims patent on. So that's why I brought that up.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think that's it. Mujahid, did you want to ask something? You were muted.
I want to say something quickly. It's like it's a cultural apostasy, to not like meat, for Kurds. It goes so much against the thing, and you nicely described that. But it also, hospitality is kind of defenseless against the idea, because they want to reward you as a guest with the best they can offer, and what they have in as the best food, obviously it's meat, as you nicely told us, and we all know that. As a Kurd, when I came to America back in Kurdistan in Turkey, you don't get that much opportunity to eat meat, but meat remains desirable thing, and in America it becomes so available, then you end up eating too much meat. So you realize, and so there's a moment of self-consciousness emerging. So you're choosing your diet is part of your modernization process. You see, choosing your religion. Those people think this is probably against Islam, but they really don't know much about Islam. Appropriating your diet, appropriating your religion, your identity emerging. Actually, people didn't live with identities; they just lived. Now we have some tag. We say, I am, I'm vegan, I'm Kurdish, I'm Muslim, I'm American, and so on. And so that process is part of a broader transformation of modernization on the part of us Kurds as well. So, it comes with all kinds of interesting consequences, some of which you explore. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you. That was really a great break from the political turmoil and Kurdish troubles and cries and all that. At least, even if we don't taste it, we hear about food.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. John, and thank you all very much for joining today, this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate all the comments and all the questions. Thanks so much.
All right. Hope to see you next time on March 19 with Frangiz Gadari's talk, and you have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.